Section 0 of Women of the War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by T.R. Love. Women of the War by Barbara McLaren, with an introduction by the Right Honorable H. Asquith, Member of Parliament. Introduction. I have read this volume with an interest which I feel confident will be widely shared by the English-speaking public. Its simple and unexaggerated account of the varied fields of work which have enlisted during the last 3 years the energies and efforts of women of our race forms a unique chapter in the annals of war. Looked at as a whole, these narratives are as good evidence as can be found of the depth and universality of the appeal which the war has made to our women, not only for sympathy, but for service. For the first time, it has taught us as a nation to realize how large and how decisive is the part that can be played in a worldwide contest by those who are prevented from taking a place in the actual fighting line. There is no question here of any form of compulsion. The services and sacrifices which are described in these pages were given and suffered spontaneously by volunteers. That they should have been on such a scale, covering such wide and diverse activities, and shared in by women of every class and of so many types of special or general capacity, is a speaking tribute not only to the quickened sense of national duty, but to the commanding and irresistible authority of a great cause. Hardly less remarkable is the testimony which this book affords to the versatility, one might say the inventiveness, displayed in the share which women have contributed to the general stock of patriotic effort. They have done and are doing things which, before the war, most of us would have said were both foreign to their nature and beyond their physical capacity. It would be invidious to discriminate, but anyone turning over these pages will find abundant illustrations. Nor can it be doubted that these experiences and achievements will, when the war is over, have a permanent effect upon both the statesman's and the economist's conception of the powers and functions of women in the reconstructed world. But I must leave the book to speak for itself and teach its own lessons. It does not profess to be an exhaustive account of women's work in the war. It is content with the more modest task of selecting and describing some typical cases. I know the scrupulous care with which it has been prepared, and I heartily commend it, not only as a trustworthy and uncolored delineation of actual fact, but as a message of stimulus and inspiration to us all. H. Asquith. Preface. These accounts of the work of some British women during the war have been collected, not with any attempt at even outlining the scope of women's achievement, but simply as pictures, showing the influence which women in varied spheres have exercised in the course of the war. Some of those whose records follow are women who, by force of character and personality, would always have stood apart, even in the limited opportunities of peacetime. Others are taken rather as types of workers, representing many hundreds who are serving the country in similar ways. The selection has seemed at times invidious, but it is easy to realize that when the numbers of workers are so immense in each of the fields of activity mentioned in the book, no complete record of individual effort can be attempted. The object in writing of the experiences of particular workers is to present a more vivid story than a merely general description could convey. True understanding of our women's war work can come only from personal experience or through the power of a keen imagination. Those who have no other opportunities can appreciate that work by visualizing the measure of endurance, patience, determination, and unflinching courage demanded for the successful performance of the tasks which women have undertaken. If any of these chapters succeed in creating a living atmosphere in which readers picture themselves working under similar conditions in similar fields of labor, the primary object of the book will have been fulfilled. Much will be written hereafter on every form of women's service touched on in these little accounts. They claim only to be windows through which may be seen that wide vista which has for its foreground the fulfillment of the great tasks of the war, and for its background a limitless horizon of potential effort. B. McLaren. End of section 0. Section 1 of Women of the War by Barbara McLaren. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by T.R. Love. 1. Dr. Garrett Anderson, CBE, and Dr. Flora Murray, CBE. Dr. Garrett Anderson and Dr. Flora Murray have contributed one of the finest pages to the annals of women's work during the war, and by their success have greatly advanced the position of women in the medical world. Dr. Garrett Anderson was already a well-known surgeon, and Dr. Flora Murray equally well-known as a physician in pre-war days, the former having qualified in 1897 and the latter in 1903. Dr. Garrett Anderson is a daughter of Mrs. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, M.D., the first British medical woman. During the month after the war broke out, Dr. Garrett Anderson and Dr. Flora Murray together organized a voluntary women's hospital unit staffed by medical women and offered their services to the French Red Cross. They established a hospital of 100 beds in Paris at Clérich's Hôtel Champs-Élysées. And it is notable that this was the first of the voluntary hospitals in Paris to start work in September 1914. Both British and French wounded were received and treated. It was not long before the excellent work of these two doctors attracted very special attention, with the result that they were approached by the War Office and asked to organize a hospital at Wimereux near Bologna, attached to the Royal Army Medical Corps. This invitation was a considerable triumph, for it was the first time that medical women were officially singled out by the British government and given equal responsibility with medical men. The Army medical authorities were quick to realize how wisely their trust had been bestowed, and in February 1915, Dr. Garrett Anderson and Dr. Flora Murray were asked to take up work on a larger scale and to undertake the entire management of the Endell Street Hospital, a large military hospital in London. During its 2 years of work for the sick and wounded, no military hospital has succeeded in establishing a finer record. To see it is a wonderful experience. The hospital consists of 17 wards with 578 beds and is entirely staffed by women. Surgeons, doctors, pathologists, oculists, dental surgeons, anesthetists, dispensers, nurses, orderlies. The only men are the patients. Sir Alfred Keogh, the Director General of the Army Medical Service, said when speaking of it, "The hospital is in every respect a military hospital, differing in no way from any other military hospital in the country. Major operations comparable to those in any other institution are performed, and there is no limitation whatever, either medical or surgical, to the functions which the staff of the hospital undertakes. Particularly excellent work has been done in the pathological departments. A special feature of the surgery of the hospital has been the adoption there of a new method of treating wounds, introduced by Professor Rutherford Morrison. This treatment consists of the use of a bismuth iodoform paraffin paste for cases of septic wounds and fractures. Writing of the treatment, Dr. Garrett Anderson says, "In every case, photor has disappeared, sepsis has subsided, and union of bone has taken place with astonishing rapidity, while the condition of the patient has benefited greatly from being spared painful daily dressings." Set in the very center of London and surrounded by tall buildings, with the buzz and whir of London traffic all about it, a visitor would be inclined at first to think the hospital a sad and gloomy place. But that impression soon passes, for in the wards, bright with color, in the recreation room and library, but most of all in the faces of the soldier patients, happiness and contentment are the prevailing elements. An atmosphere is as hard to describe as it is easy to recognize, but the atmosphere of the Women's Hospital breathes rest and quiet, and the mutual confidence between patients and doctors, which is so invaluable an asset in successful treatment. Here, then, for the first time, it has been proved beyond all dispute, both to the medical profession and to the world outside, that women doctors and surgeons can equal the success of men in all branches of their calling, and not only with the ailments of women and children. The work that these women have proved themselves able to accomplish and to continue without sign of strain during 3 years of war ought at last to secure the recognition that it deserves. Dr. Garrett Anderson and Dr. Flora Murray will feel that they have worked successfully, not only for their patients, but for medical women in general, if, as a result of their demonstration, the doors of the medical schools are thrown open to women. That the majority of medical women working for their country today have been forced to gain their knowledge and skill in the schools of the enemy is surely one of the conditions which the war will sweep away forever. 2. Lady Paget, GBE. As a monument to human endurance and courage, there can be no more wonderful record than that of Lady Paget's hospital unit in Serbia. The whole unit, several members of which were Americans, worked with a devotion and a loyalty unsurpassed during the war. But in Lady Paget they had a born leader and a woman of indomitable heroism. At all the crucial moments, of which there were many, Lady Paget's wisdom, tact, foresight, and rapidity of decision saved the situation and enabled her hospital to render inestimable work to stricken Serbia. Lady Paget, as wife of a former British minister to Serbia, already possessed a wide experience of Balkan hospital work, having worked through the 2 Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. In November 1914, Lady Paget's hospital unit reached Uzku. This was one of the most critical phases for Serbia in the whole war. The Austrian invasion was at its height, and the Serbian armies, their ammunition exhausted, were being driven helplessly through the country before the enemy guns. Uzku was one of the main hospital bases, though the conditions there were of the roughest as regards sanitation and hospital equipment. As soon as Lady Paget's hospital could be hurriedly installed, it was filled to overflowing with wounded Serbian soldiers, and for 3 months the work was incessant. When the surgical work began to slacken, the great typhus epidemic swept over the country. The Serbians had no means of meeting it, and Lady Paget, with 2 doctors and 2 nurses, by superhuman labors, prepared a great typhus colony at Uzku. Lady Paget herself taking the hardest menial work of scrubbing and cooking, and sparing herself no risk in washing and caring for the infected patients. By the labors of this gallant staff of 5, and some Austrian prisoners working under them as orderlies, huge barracks were converted into hospital buildings and filled with hundreds of typhus-stricken soldiers within little over a week. Then Lady Paget herself caught the deadly fever, and for many days her life was despaired of. She was so much beloved throughout Serbia that her danger was felt as a national disaster, and the children of peasants in faraway places where she was known only by name were taught to pray for her daily, while in the synagogues a special day was set apart for prayers for her recovery. In the spring, before Lady Paget was fully restored to health, she returned to England to prepare for further work, and in July 1915 she again went to Serbia. She returned to her previous headquarters at Uskub and reorganized her staff, and during August and September the hospital was continuously full. About the middle of October, the storm of invasion again broke over the unhappy little country, and while the German and Austrian armies swept down from the north, the Bulgarians poured in from the east. It was at this point that Lady Paget had one of her most momentous decisions to make. The Serbian population was flying before the oncoming tide of the enemy armies. One of the greatest tragedies in history, Lady Paget wrote. A nation was shattered, crushed, and driven forth into the wilderness to die of cold and hunger. But refusing to desert her Serbian patients, and in the hope of being able to save her large hospital stores for the help of the refugees, Lady Paget, with her staff, gallantly decided, in spite of strong opposition, to remain at Uskub and face the enemy. Describing this critical decision, a friend wrote of her, "Lady Paget's will was the only fixed point that night in the universal landslide around her. By setting her single will against the stampede, she turned back the flood of panic that was hurrying the wretched inhabitants of the town away to certain destruction." For the next day, in Uskub, when it became known that the British mission was staying to look after the wounded, it went far to reassure the people, and hundreds who would otherwise have gone to their death in the icy mountains of Albania remained in the shelter of their homes. With the coming of the Bulgarians on October 22nd began a long and difficult period. Until the middle of February 1916, the hospital unit remained at Uskub, prisoners in the enemy's hands. But owing to Lady Paget's tact and resource, they were able to carry on work of inestimable value, not only in nursing many hundred wounded, both Serbian, Bulgarian, and Austrian, but also in feeding and clothing thousands of Serbian refugees. Through the worst weeks of winter, between 3,000 and 4,000 were fed and clothed daily, and from first to last, over 70,000 were relieved entirely from Lady Paget's stores. It is a remarkable tribute to her personality that the enemy, though not too plentifully equipped themselves, should yet have allowed her to retain possession of this large quantity of stores, trusting as they did to her scrupulous sense of fairness and straight dealing. By February 1916, Lady Paget and her workers had done all in their power for Serbia. By this time, the refugees had either been interned or sent to their homes. The hospital had been evacuated of patients, the staff was worn out with hard work, and the stores were exhausted. After difficult negotiations, Lady Paget obtained permission to leave and was able to return with her unit to England. This is the third war in which she has given herself unsparingly to help the Serbians, and she has become an object of worship to this desolate people. To mark the national gratitude, King Peter has bestowed upon her the first class of the Order of St. Sava, an honor that had never before been given to an uncrowned woman. 3. Miss Lillian Barker, CBE, and Miss Mabel Cotterell. The first element in the great development of munition work during the war, which has drawn women in tens of thousands into the service of their country, has certainly been the all-powerful motive of patriotism. But second to this, the practical success of the work has been made possible largely through the recognition and development of welfare work. What we understand nowadays by welfare does not consist merely in the provision of canteens and other amenities for workers. It means the study of human nature, the introduction of the humanizing element into work. Experience has proven that there is nothing in the world so calculated to get the best out of human nature as the human touch. Welfare work, undertaken sporadically in this country since the beginning of the 19th century, has been gradually introduced in our factories by the more enlightened employers, but the advent of women in such great numbers to munition works has set the seal of official approval on the system. The result of this work cannot be better illustrated than by the example of what has been accomplished by two of the most successful welfare workers. Miss Lillian Barker, the lady superintendent at the Royal Arsenal at Woolwich, supervises the women operators employed there with the good humor and sagacity of an ideal statesman. When Miss Barker took up her work at Woolwich in December 1915, there were 400 women and girls employed at the Arsenal. Today, there are over 25,000, every one of whom has been personally engaged by this superwoman of Woolwich. Round Miss Barker's office there gathers a consistent throng of workers, and it is one of her tasks, with the assistants whom she has trained, to straighten out their difficulties, to inquire into their grievances, and to act, if need be, as mediator with their superior officers. She advises all who come to her for help as to their health, their meals, their recreation, and the 101 details which the domestic guardian of a huge works can set to rights by understanding, patience, and tact. It is hard to give an adequate impression of the wonderful atmosphere which Miss Barker has created at Woolwich, but a visitor privileged to go round the shops in her company cannot fail to be deeply struck, not only by her influence with the workers, but by the general sense of contentment and health. As one approaches a shop, one hears the girls singing at their work, a sure sign of happiness. When Miss Barker enters, their faces light up, gay greetings pass, and one feels instinctively the confidence and mutual trust with which she has inspired her great family. Miss Barker makes frequent tours round the women's shops. It is said to take a week to go over the whole arsenal, and all the time she is on the watch for possible improvements, perhaps the better ventilation of a factory, or some needed alteration in a cloakroom, stopping ever and again for a word with a girl on some matter relating to her well-being. It is rare to see a sickly face, even among the workers in the danger zone, and visitors are struck by the high proportion of good looks, even of beauty. The workers are drawn from every grade of society, but the democracy of the overall and cap levels all distinctions. Recently, much trouble was experienced by the Arsenal management owing to bad timekeeping in the shops. Able to earn considerable sums of money by working only 3 or 4 days weekly, the girls were apt to stay away for the rest of the week. Miss Barker was approached and asked to take over the responsibility for the timekeeping, never before part of her work, and the results were astonishing. "If you leave 200 fuse rings incomplete," she would say, in making personal appeals to the small groups of girls, "they delay 200 fuses. 200 fuses delay 200 shells from being sent out to the front. Think what 200 shells might mean to Tommy in a tight corner." Miss Barker knows the wisdom of instilling into each worker the sense of her personal responsibility, and under her inspiration, the timekeeping difficulty is no longer an acute problem. Miss Mabel Cotterell is another welfare worker who has accomplished a stupendous task. Little more than a year ago, the first buildings of the greatest filling factory in the country began to rise from a desolate bog on the borders of England and Scotland. During the year, a town has grown to house thousands of women employees who came to work in answer to the national appeal for their help. Miss Cotterell engaged and took to Gretna the first 50 fisher girls from the Aberdeen coast. I had one assistant in those days, Miss Cotterell recalls, and we met the newcomers at the countryside station and took them over the fields to the hostel and the bungalow which had been furnished for their use. It was well they came first in the summer days, for there were then no proper roads, no lights, no shops, no halls or club rooms, while at the factory the canteens were not ready for use. However, it was warm and sunny, and there were flowers, and the birds sang. The girls carried sandwich lunches with them, had a good meat meal on returning to the hostel, and a pleasant country walk in the evening. Today, there are 64 hostels and 30 bungalows at Gretna, and Miss Cotterell has an army of assistants, clerks, matrons, and factory supervisors. The former wilderness is now inhabited by a well-housed community, organized in all details with a thoroughness and practical care which speak volumes for the genius of its moving spirit. When the workers came to inhabit the convenient and attractive homes prepared for them, they found that equally enlightened plans had been formulated for their welfare. Miss Cotterell has kept careful watch of the leisure hours of those under her charge, and she has seen that every opportunity for rest, recreation, and improvement is open to them, and facilities for reading, riding, playing games, and attending classes. Periodic entertainments are given, sometimes by the Gretna Ramblers, a troupe of munition girls who have been trained in singing, dancing, and recitation. The added responsibility of having the girls entirely resident, as at Gretna, entails serious problems. The whole work of catering and the domestic arrangements of the hostels fall on the welfare department. Another of its duties is to file the record of every girl in the factory, and the procedure for discharges, leaves of absence, transfers, or sick leave all passes through this department. A considerable task when, at the rate which the factory is increasing, as many as 200 new girls arrive in one day. Inevitably, difficulties of administration are not unknown, even in a model community. There has been occasional shortage of furniture, dampness of new houses, or girl workers unaccustomed to discipline who decline to obey orders. But difficulties seem to vanish under Miss Cotterell's experienced touch. Her wise administration is already responsible for a marked improvement, not only in health and physique, which good food, clean housing, and regular employment have brought to the workers. Her influence is also noticeable in a great regard for truth, honesty, and duty. This outcome of women's munition work will mean much in the future developments of their industrial life. Women like Miss Barker and Miss Cotterell, in attempting a great achievement, have accomplished an immeasurable one. End of section 1. Section 2 of Women of the War by Barbara McLaren. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by T.R. Love. 4. Miss C.E. Matheson and the Village Land Workers. Early in 1915, when recruiting for the Army was beginning to draw men away from agriculture as from all other work, a first effort was made to substitute women for men on the land. Although she knew nothing of agriculture or the management of livestock and was unaccustomed to hard manual work, Miss Matheson determined to offer herself as one of the pioneers. Before the war, she was known in a very different sphere, for as a promising authoress of the younger school, she had already attracted wide popularity. On volunteering, Miss Matheson was sent for a 4 weeks agricultural training course to a farm institute to learn to milk, to make butter, to harness and drive a team, to clean, dress, and prepare land, to plant and hoe, to clean stables and cow houses, to feed cattle, to disregard backaches, weariness, and blistered hands, and to live a new, hard life. After this breaking in, she went to a Wiltshire dairy farmer who possessed 40 to 50 cows in milk. He was prejudiced against women workers, and Miss Matheson's first day was not a happy one. Writing of it afterwards, she said, "I traveled on a Saturday. On Sunday morning I assisted with the milking, and I found I was expected to milk at least 8 or 10 animals. My 4 weeks' training had simply taught me how. There had been little time for practicing new accomplishments. Consequently, my employer told me he would not require me after the end of the week. This announcement was a shock and exceedingly discouraging. However, I toiled through that week, and at the end of it was asked to stay. Soon I was milking from 8 to 15 cows twice a day, had full charge of the churns and pails, took the milk to the station to meet the London train, looked after the poultry, and helped on the land, harvesting, threshing, spreading manure, etc. Of course, such work meant rising at 5, and by the time Miss Matheson returned from her evening drive to the station, it was nearly 7. But the station drive was, she said, a pleasurable duty, for the sight of the London train reminded me that I still lived in the world. Miss Matheson spent 7 months on the Wiltshire farm, and the farmer on her departure paid her the compliment of engaging 3 girls to assist him. She then went to the Prince of Wales farm on the Duchy of Cornwall estate, where she is still working. This farm specializes in stock breeding, and the herd is a large and valuable one. With cows to milk, calves to rear, bulls to groom and exercise, food to prepare, bedding to change, the work is perpetual, for there are only 3 workers to tend the animals, and people in charge of stock must work 7 days a week. During the winter, the cattle claim all the time and attention, but in the summer, Miss Matheson manages to help on the land in addition. When autumn came, Miss Matheson's employers at the Duchy farm began to wonder if she would be able to stand the winter work, but she hastened unhesitatingly to reassure them. The work certainly needs pluck and endurance, both physical and mental. The handling of bulls, for instance, demands no small amount of nerve. "I have had 1 or 2 adventures with the bulls," wrote Miss Matheson to a friend, "and though I must confess I tremble at times, I manage to hold my own. Of course, I could get help if I asked for it, but I do dislike asking. It gives one such an only a girl sort of feeling, and then again I am always afraid to let anyone know that sometimes I am afraid." It is unnecessary to state the reasons which bring an educated woman voluntarily to take up such a hard and exacting life, not merely for a few weeks of summer, but month after month. Only a deep-rooted motive can be the impelling force, and there can be no finer form of patriotism than the unsensational performance of these strenuous tasks, far from the glamour and excitement of direct contact with the war. Not only in the fruits of her own labor, but by the force of her example, as one of the pioneers along a new road for women, Miss Matheson is performing as fine a war service as any English woman today. Just as the educated women have made an inspiring response to the call of the country in taking up agricultural work, so also have the women of the villages. In many country districts, they have always been accustomed to work on the land. But today, thousands who never worked before have come forward to give the most concrete proof of their patriotism. They are rightly proud to be entitled to wear the green government armlet given for 30 days' work or 240 hours. The most recent development of women's land work is their employment on timber felling and bark stripping. And though this is a completely new industry for women, and has not so far been taken up on a general scale, the results of the first experiments are full of promise. Timber work has been started in Devonshire under the energetic auspices of Miss Calmady Hamlin, the inspecting officer for the Western District of England under the Board of Agriculture. An expert woodman instructor, after watching some of the novices at work, pronounced that in barking, these women already excel men, and in tree felling, they will certainly equal them. Many of the village women whose husbands are serving have wisely taken up land work as being the best antidote to worry. From Devonshire comes the story of a soldier ordered to the front who gave his wife the parting counsel, "My dear, you go up and work on that old field tomorrow. It will help you more than anything." Mrs. Hawken went and worked indomitably at any job in all weathers, and is proud that she can earn a man's day wage at piecework. "Why I am a war worker is because I felt it was my duty to do my bit," Mrs. Hawken writes. "I am a married woman with 3 children. My husband has joined the army, and I have done my best to help my country. As I live in the country, there is nothing for me to do but to work on the land, which I have done for nearly 2 years. I have worked on the farm doing various kinds of work, such as weeding corn, hoeing turnips, spreading manure over the fields, turning up ground, picking in apples, wheeling away coke, helping in the harvest fields, both hay and corn, and by what our employers have told our instructor, we have given them every satisfaction." Mrs. Hawken has recently taken up the new timber felling work and is now leader of a gang of woodwomen. Though she is new to the work, Mrs. Hawken is able to fell trees at the rate of 30 in half a day, and she states that she does not find the work unduly fatiguing, though a bit windy. An agricultural demonstration by women held recently in Surrey under the auspices of the Board of Agriculture provided striking examples of the excellence of women's agricultural work. 120 women took part, the majority of whom have started the work since the war. They entered for competitions in plowing, harrowing, milking, management of calves and horses, hoeing corn, hand weeding, etc. In spite of the difficulties occasioned by bad weather and having to work with strange animals under unfamiliar conditions, the women succeeded in making a deep impression on the farmers who came to watch their efforts. The sensation of the afternoon was caused in the milking competition, when the first prize was won by Miss M. Sutar, aged 10 and a half, who obtained a total of 95 points out of a possible 100. Experimental demonstrations of this kind will do much to solve one of the greatest difficulties in the employment of women, namely the conversion of the farmers. But most of those who have given the women a chance have not had cause to regret it. When the farmers recognize the motive behind the women's work and are willing not only to employ them but to treat them generously, it is certain that both farmers and women, working together under the same influence of patriotism, are bound to achieve results of which both may be proud. 5. Dr. Elsie Inglis. To Miss Inglis, MBCM, belongs the honor of originating the Scottish Women's Hospitals, one of the noblest efforts achieved by women in the war. As a medical woman, Dr. Inglis, who qualified in 1892, has specialized in surgery, and for many years she has held the posts of surgeon and gynecologist to the Edinburgh Hospital and Dispensary for Women and Children, and lecturer to the School of Medicine in Edinburgh. At the outbreak of war, Dr. Inglis felt that the medical services of women should be organized for the country, and she originated the idea of forming the Scottish Women's Hospital Units for war service, staffed entirely by women. The idea was carried out through the organization of the Scottish Federation of Women Suffrage Societies. In the early months, the War Office, though since converted, refused to accept women's hospitals, so Dr. Inglis and her committee offered their services to the Allies. Their record of work is truly wonderful and presents an outstanding example of women's industry and administrative ability. Hospitals have been established and maintained in France, Serbia, Corsica, Salonika, Romania, and Russia, and the work has been entirely supported by the funds which the organization has raised, mainly through the branches of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies throughout Great Britain. Dr. Inglis has been throughout the leading spirit and has displayed extraordinary initiative. After spending the first months of the war in starting the work at headquarters, she went to Serbia in 1915 to act as commissioner to the Scottish women's hospitals established there. One unit on its way to Serbia was detained for a few weeks in Malta for service with the British wounded at a moment of medical shortage. And Lord Methuen, the military governor, wrote a glowing appreciation of their work. "They leave here," he wrote, "blessed by myself, surgeons, nurses, and patients alike, having proved themselves most capable and untiring workers." In Serbia, the Scottish women were confronted with all the hardships and difficulties experienced by workers in that unfortunate country. Undaunted, however, they established their hospitals, heroically overcoming the problems of sanitation and supplies which beset them on all sides. The hospital at Kragujevac, over which Dr. Inglis had personal charge, was described by the military authorities as a picture of cleanliness, order, and comfort. When the time of the Serbian retreat came, the 5 hospitals in charge of the Scottish women fell back towards Albania. At Kruševac, Dr. Inglis decided to remain with her staff to care for the Serbian wounded during the enemy occupation. Another unit under Dr. Alice Hutchison also stayed and was taken prisoner, while the remaining staffs accompanied the retreating armies across the mountains. These months at Kruševac were a strange mixture of sorrow and happiness, Dr. Inglis wrote afterwards. There was a curious exhilaration in working for those grateful, patient men, yet the unhappiness in the Serbian households and the physical wretchedness of those cold, hungry prisoners lay always like a dead weight on our spirits. By February 1916, the hospital was emptied and the staff sent as prisoners to Vienna. After enduring many discomforts, they were eventually released through the good offices of the American Embassy and enabled to return to England, where their friends had heard no word of them during 4 months. When the veil was at last lifted, it showed Dr. Inglis coming out of all the stress and suffering, the first woman to wear the decoration of the White Eagle given to her by the Serbian government in recognition of her services. Other members of her unit received the Order of St. Sava. "The Serbian nation," said the Crown Prince, "will never forget what these women have done." But not content with such services to Serbia, and with her courage still undaunted, Dr. Inglis again set out in September 1916 at the head of a fresh unit for service with the Serbian army fighting in South Russia. The unit, numbering 76 women, comprised a staff of women doctors, an X-ray operator, a dispenser, 17 fully trained nurses, 16 orderlies, besides cooks and laundresses. The accompanying transport column under the Honorable Mrs. Haverfield consisted of 8 ambulances, 2 kitchen cars, a repair car, 4 lorries, and 3 touring cars, with a large staff of women chauffeurs and cooks. The unit landed at Archangel and traveled across Russia to Odessa, where the workers met with a rousing reception. They then proceeded to join the Serbian division to which they were attached in the Dobruja, and another splendid chapter of Scottish women's hospital work was opened. a base hospital was started at Medgidia in Romania, with a field station nearer the front. But after about a fortnight's work, the inevitable evacuation was ordered before the Bulgarian advance, and the unit retreated with the army. Of this first hospital in Romania, Dr. Inglis writes, "The day after the unit arrived at Medgidia, where the whole 75 were obliged to camp in one big room, wounded began to pour in, and ambulances to ply between there and the firing line. There were no roads, just tracks across endless plains." Of the field station, Dr. Inglis says, "The destination was a place smoking from shells and filled with a sense of destruction and desolation impossible to describe." The Scottish women set up camp nearby and were attached to the Serbian field hospital. Aeroplanes bombed them daily, and on one occasion the ambulance suffered a heavy bombardment. When the orders came to move, the transport went through 5 appalling days of labor, which can be understood only by people who have done cross-country treks in roadless countries. The scenes were indescribable, of confusion, terror, misery, of blocks of carts, troops, pigs, women, children, lame horses, and exhausted animals of all sorts. The refugees were throwing out things to lighten their carts, and the Scottish women got out and picked them up for use for their own kitchen. Dr. Inglis and the hospital party, on evacuating Medgidia, managed to secure what is known as a sanitary train, a long train of horse wagons, very different from an ambulance train, and they had to do their best for the crowd of wounded on board. Eventually, Dr. Inglis reached Braila, where she was able to render valuable help to a large number of Romanian wounded who were very short of medical assistance. Some members of the unit have since returned to England, but Dr. Inglis is still in Romania. She is temporarily working for the Russian army, pending the reformation of the Serbian divisions, to which she will return. The general in command of the Russian Red Cross on the Romanian front, Prince Dolgrankov, has conferred the Medal of St. George on all the members of the unit now at Reni who have worked under fire. Wherever the odds against the Allies seem overwhelming, there one may be nearly sure of finding a unit of the Scottish women's hospitals working for the wounded, writes an admirer of their work. You do not find them in the well-equipped hospitals, surrounded by every modern appliance, with crowds of men orderlies to carry out the heavy work, but rather in the back blocks of the war, as one may say, fighting a desperate battle of their own against dirt, disease, and wounds, and winning back precious lives of men whose language is in many cases unknown to them. Dr. Elsie Inglis has that magnetic personality which can command efficiency, even with inadequate equipment and in hopeless environment. The inspiring work of this great woman doctor makes her indeed a worthy leader for those wonderful Scottish women who are putting their whole soul into the work they have undertaken, without any thought of recompense, without vainglory, and without any other motive than the desire to help and heal. End of section 2. Section 3 of Women of the War by Barbara McLaren. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by T.R. Love. 6. Miss Harriet Sprott, the Mrs. Playfair, and Lady Baden-Powell. The Young Men's Christian Association commenced work in the camps in France as soon as the war began. For many years it had been accustomed to provide huts in the summer camps at home, but since the war, the organization has increased to such an extent that it now covers a vast field of enterprise. The YMCA huts and those of the church army have proved the salvation of the men who, when off duty, had nowhere to go. While in the camps, the canteens provide an opportunity for them to buy small necessaries, tobacco, or any supplementary food in addition to their army rations. The work of the ladies in the YMCA huts in France is largely responsible for their great success. This work is arranged by a committee under Princess Helena Victoria, with the Countess of Bessborough as honorary secretary, and it is owing to their insight and skillful organization that it has been so successfully managed. The workers, whose service is entirely voluntary, sign on for 4 months, pay all their own expenses, traveling, board, lodging, etc., and provide their uniform, dark gray coats and skirts with blue facings. Many of them have been living in France for over 2 years in the simplest accommodation, devoid of all luxury, and devoting themselves entirely to the work. The best illustration of what they are doing can be taken from the experiences of a few typical workers. Miss Harriet Sprott manages a district which has its headquarters in a base town under the shadow of a great cathedral. Describing the average day of her workers, Miss Sprott says that their mornings till 12 o'clock are spent in preparation of the canteen counters, so that the quickest possible distribution of refreshments and other small purchases may be made to the soldiers in the short hours fixed by the camp authorities which they may spend at the hut. No money is taken over the counter. Tickets have to be bought. It is usual for the queue of men waiting to buy tickets to extend the whole length of the room. On a busy night, it even stretches into the billiard room and curls back halfway up the main hut. Old YMCA habitués know the arrangements so well that no time is wasted, but Miss Sprott reports that it takes double the time to serve a newly arrived draft to whom the French money and its purchasing power are sources of bewilderment. The heaviest part of the work is always at night, but the men are unanimously said to be so good-natured, patient, and orderly that however dense the crowd, they all get served in time. When the hut closes, the workers may be justified in feeling that valuable work has been accomplished and the night's rest well earned. In every hut, there is a small library counter where postcards are sold, notepaper is given out, books or games are lent, and games of billiards are arranged, a bell being rung every 20 minutes to mark the close of each game. Miss Sprott writes, "To sit down here is considered a rest, but one can have a busy time. Private A brings his watch and hopes it will not be too much trouble to get it mended for him. You take down his name and hope the watch will not get mixed up with some half-dozen others passing through your hands, and that you will be able to get it back in time from the watchmaker before Private A goes up the line." He himself has apparently no misgivings. Indeed, the implicit faith of himself and his fellows in one's unworthy self is something quite touching. Many questions are asked and answered. I have been consulted on religious matters and listened to innumerable family histories. The first move in a confidential talk comes when Tommy pulls out his paybook and spreads before you the photos of his relatives. To most of us, the hour spent each evening at this little counter is one to look forward to. Another worker is Miss Lilias Playfair, who, with a group of other ladies, went to a base town in France in February 1915. A canteen had been started in the only available place, a very small, inconvenient room. But even so, Miss Playfair reports that it was packed every evening and most of the day. Gradually, proper huts were built in the outlying camps and in the town, and there are now over 10 huts and 2 cinemas in this district, which Miss Playfair and her sister Miss Audrey Playfair manage in alternate spells. Describing her work, Miss Playfair says, "Besides serving at the canteens and helping with the arranging and ordering of food, we do most of the entertainments. I have organized a small orchestra which plays at different huts, and last year we had a most successful Pierrot troupe. We hope shortly to produce a review and 2 or 3 short plays. French classes are held regularly, and the men are keen to learn. It is hard work, as our hours are long, but it is very interesting, and the men are so appreciative and say that they do not know how they could endure things without the YMCA. How much the Tommies appreciate the presence of the YMCA ladies may be seen in the following extract written by a Tommy describing what he calls a heaven-sent organization. When I entered the hut, I was greeted with that glad smile of welcome which I shall always associate with the YMCA by real English ladies, the first I had seen for over 7 months, except the nurses, of course. I only wish to God that I could adequately describe my feelings, and I know mine were the same as thousands of my brothers in arms. It seemed to me that amidst all the awful turmoil and din, with the horrors of the retreat and the first battle for Ypres imperishably photographed on my memory, I had found a haven of rest. Volumes could be written by the lady workers on the mingled humor and pathos in their interviews with the men. In a letter to a friend at home, a worker says, "All the time out here, life is so full of humor, if only one had the gift of describing it. At one moment, one is doing something for a very correct general, and at the next, one is in a hut having tea with a soldier. Ex-greengrocer, quite charming, but the unmistakable type. Everyone who interests the greengrocer has to sign their names in his Bible. Then one takes an Australian out shopping, and he tips one 2 francs for one's trouble." Quite apart from their ministrations to the men's material needs, the influence of the YMCA ladies in France has been invaluable, cheering, encouraging, and helping the men in countless ways in their brief hours of leisure, and relieving by their presence the endless monotony of their life of discipline. Among the interesting features of the YMCA work are the scout huts started by Lady Baden-Powell at 2 of the bases. The ladies who work in them are mostly scout masters and wear the scout uniform, old Boy Scouts amongst the troops being their most keenly appreciative patrons. Lady Baden-Powell went to France in October 1915 to organize the work when the huts were built, and she worked for some months in the first 2 huts. In June 1916, a Girl Guide hut was built from funds earned by Girl Guides who, forbidden by their rules from collecting money, each did a day's work for the fund. Lady Baden-Powell is putting her energies into developing the Girl Guide movement on the same scale as the Boy Scouts. Realizing the responsibilities of citizenship which the opportunities of the war have brought to the women of the country, the advantages are manifest of a voluntary training for girls on the lines which have been so successful with boys, and the Girl Guide movement is a step to this end. 7. Miss Agnes Borthwick. No woman's work has more directly furthered the prosecution of the war than that of Miss Agnes Borthwick, who within 1 year has risen to the unique position, for a woman, of works manager in a great munition factory. When Miss Borthwick sees the trains laden with ammunition streaming out of the factory straight for Southampton, she must feel with justifiable pride that she and her 4,000 girls are working for the country as vitally as the soldiers who will fire the unceasing stream of shells which the girls are sending to them day by day. Miss Borthwick's rise to her present position of responsibility has been rapid, even judged by the standards of war promotion. She is of Scottish birth, a woman of high educational attainments. She took an honors MA degree in English at Glasgow University in 1912 and subsequently held a research scholarship at Bryn Mawr College, USA. Miss Borthwick spent 2 years studying in America, and from Bryn Mawr went to Whittier Hall, University of Columbia, New York, and Barnard Hall, Radcliffe College, Cambridge, Massachusetts. She also did some research in Harvard Library. At the outbreak of the war, Miss Borthwick returned to England, and in November 1915, when the newly formed Ministry of Munitions appealed for women workers, she volunteered and went to Woolwich for a course of training in both the theoretical and practical work of shell and cartridge filling. At the end of 5 weeks, she obtained a first grade or excellent certificate. In January 1916, Miss Borthwick was sent to Georgetown by Paisley, where a new filling factory was in course of construction. Here she began work with only 24 girls. At first, she and her workers scrubbed the shops, cleaned the newly built blocks of buildings, and unloaded the trucks of empty shells, which arrived at the factory ready to be filled with explosives. By the end of January, the shops were sufficiently prepared for the real work to begin, and 200 girls were taken on and instructed in filling. After that, the factory grew rapidly. Every week from 30 to 50 girls were engaged who started work in the new blocks, which were taken over from the builders as fast as they were finished. 2 months later, Miss Borthwick was promoted from forewoman to assistant works manager, and in May, on the promotion of the works manager, she took his place. By the end of 1916, the 24 original workers had increased to 4,000 girls. And when an inspector came round to inquire into the question of labor dilution, he was unable to eliminate a single man, for the only men employed in the factory were a few engineers and mechanical experts. Not only do the girls do all the filling of 18-pounder shells and cartridges of all sizes, but they also do the packing of the filled shells and the trolleying to the railway. The medical and nursing staff, the police patrol, the fire patrol, and the canteen workers are all women. Work never ceases night and day. The girls work in shifts of 8 3/4 hours. There are now 130 shops, and the factory covers such a large acreage that its boundary is about 5 miles round. Above everything else, it must not be forgotten that the entire work of this factory is what is called danger work. Although every possible precaution is taken for the safety and health of the workers, in all handling of powerful explosives, the element of danger must be present. Miss Borthwick is only 27. She is a fresh-looking girl with a very quiet manner, suggesting a reserve of resolution and courage eminently necessary in her work. On her shoulders rests the heavy responsibility for the successful working of the factory, and she has helped to develop it in an incredibly short time, from a few huts to the throbbing hive of industry which it is today. Owing to her efficiency, and because she has never failed to make good whatever she has undertaken, she has earned this great opportunity of service to the country. She talks of her work as calmly and naturally as if there were nothing remarkable about it. Yet she made this admission while on a recent 3 days leave. Until I come away from the factory, I hadn't realized how heavy and how unending the responsibility is. End of section 3. Section 4 of Women of the War by Barbara McLaren. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by T.R. Love. 8. Mrs. St. Clair Stobart. No woman has seen the war at closer quarters and in more varied fields of action than Mrs. St. Clair Stobart, and no one has worked harder to help the sick and wounded on the field, in besieged fortresses, at base hospitals, and in the stricken villages of a ravaged and invaded country. Everywhere she has sought and found her opportunity to bear her part in the actual campaign. a part such as no woman has ever taken before. The outbreak of war found Mrs. Stobart already trained, for she had gained her experience with the Women's Convoy Corps, which she founded, and which did such successful work in the Balkan War in 1912-1913. Early in August 1914, therefore, she was entrusted with the leadership of an ambulance unit under the organization of the St. John Ambulance Association and proceeded at once to Brussels. Before a hospital could be established, the Germans had entered the city, and Mrs. Stobart escaped with difficulty after having been actually a prisoner in German hands and condemned to be shot as a spy. Nothing daunted by her first experience, Mrs. Stobart then established a hospital in Antwerp. After 3 weeks of fine work, the town was besieged, and the bombardment began. The hospital was in the direct line of fire of one of the enemy's objectives, the ammunition depot. But under a storm of shell fire, Mrs. Stobart and her unit rescued their wounded and were themselves the last to leave the burning city, crossing the bridge of boats just before it was blown up. After the fall of Antwerp, Mrs. Stobart accepted an invitation from the French Red Cross to establish a hospital at Cherbourg. At first, the work was very heavy and the numbers of wounded enormous, but once it was started, Mrs. Stobart was able to leave the smoothly working hospital in good hands and to answer the call to help Serbia, then in such dire need. Accordingly, after spending some time in making her preparations, she traveled to Serbia in April 1915 with a fresh unit. On arrival, Mrs. Stobart began by establishing a camp hospital entirely consisting of tents at Kragujevac. It was the first experiment of this kind which had been tried, but the advantages of healthy outdoor conditions as opposed to the alternative of insanitary buildings were soon proved, for the hospital, which had been requested by the Serbian medical authorities to undertake surgical work, entirely escaped the scourge of typhus. Unfortunately, this was not so with regard to typhoid, from which several members of the staff died in June 1915, including the well-known author Mrs. Percy Dearmer, who, though far from strong, had offered her services to the unit and had already done fine work. During the first 3 months, the hospital undertook both civil and military cases, and Mrs. Stobart organized a further invaluable and successful scheme in establishing roadside tent dispensaries in 7 or 8 remote villages. Altogether, within a few weeks, 22,000 civilians received surgical and medical assistance. At the end of September 1915 came a signal proof of the confidence which Miss Stobart had inspired in Serbia. The army was preparing its fresh resistance to the second invasion, and the Bulgarians were on the eve of declaring war. Mrs. Stobart was approached by the Serbian military authorities and asked to mobilize a portion of her unit as a flying field hospital. She was appointed commander with the rank of major in the Serbian army, the first time in history that such an appointment has been given to a woman. And the unit, which was called the 1st Serbian English Field Hospital, was attached to the Šumadija Division. After making arrangements for the continuation of the work of the Kragujevac Hospital, Mrs. Stobart chose for the ambulance column a dozen of her English women doctors and nurses, motor ambulance drivers, a cook, orderlies, interpreters, and about 60 Serbian soldiers. On October 1, the column started for the Bulgarian front, traveling by train through Niš to Pirot. But after a few days of trekking in that direction, the column was ordered to move north with the division to within a few miles of Belgrade on the Danube front to face the stronger enemy, the Germans and the Austrians. On October 14th, the hospital camp was pitched within sound of the guns, and the first batches of wounded were received. But the stand of the Serbian army was destined to be a short one. 2 days later, orders came to move southwards, and the first stage began of the Great Retreat, which was to continue steadily for 3 months. The life of the members of the field hospital during the retreat was indeed a strange one, for ever on the march, stopping for a few hours to pitch a tent and attend to the wounded brought to them from the battlefields close at hand, evacuating them by motor ambulance to the nearest railway or hospital, and then marching on again. Throughout the retreat, Mrs. Stobart rode at the head of her column night and day, selecting every inch of their road, struggling for a place for them in the endless procession of the straggling host that beset the mud-sodden roads and slippery mountain paths, obtaining food for them and their horses with infinite difficulty in the deserted villages through which the column passed. Forced to snatch odd hours of sleep when and where they could, always fully dressed and prepared for the orders to march at any moment, they often narrowly escaped capture. The sound of the enemy guns was ever in their ears, the invading armies always at their heels. Mrs. Stobart truly proved herself a leader in fact as well as in name, for no trained commander of troops could have shown a higher courage or faced emergencies with a more decided energy than this Englishwoman. It was a cruel day for the hospital column when, at the end of a terrible forced march, during which Miss Stobart was 81 hours in the saddle, the motor ambulance and the hospital equipment had at last to be destroyed and abandoned at the foot of the Montenegrin mountains, through which Mrs. Stobart then led her skeleton column on foot. The horrors of the retreat increased every day, but the only way to safety had to be faced, though it lay over trackless mountains 8,000 feet high, through snow, ice, unbroken forests, and bridgeless rivers. It was then midwinter. Men and animals died by the roadside in hundreds from starvation and exposure. Writing of the retreat afterwards, Mrs. Stobart said, "Continued cold, exhaustion from forced marches, and increasing lack of food made the track a shambles. Men by the hundred lay dead from cold and hunger by the roadside, and no one could stop to bury them. But worse still, men lay dying by the roadside, dying from cold and hunger, and no one could stay to tend them." The whole scene was a combination of mental and physical misery, difficult to describe in words. No one knows, nor ever will know accurately, how many people perished, but it is believed that not less than 10,000 human beings lay sepulchred in those mountains. At last, on December 20, Mrs. Stobart had the triumph of leading her weary but courageous column into Scutari in Albania, without the loss of a single one of its members, the only commander who succeeded in bringing a column intact through the retreat. The chief officer of the Serbian medical staff expressed true sentiments when he wrote to Mrs. Stobart, "You have made everybody believe that a woman can overcome and endure all the war difficulties. You can be sure, esteemed madam, that you have won the sympathies of the whole of Serbia." 9. Miss E. G. Bather and Miss Dorothy Ravenscroft. Miss Bather is one of the women whose sporting experiences in pre-war days have turned to valuable account in the service of her country. Her knowledge of horses, gained in the enjoyment of hunting, has enabled her to undertake the serious and arduous work of running a remount depot for the War Office under Mr. Cecil Alden, MFH. Many girls who have hunted or had their own horses might think that they could easily do remount work, but it is not merely a case of being able to ride well. The riding is only the lightest part of the duties. It is a matter of settling down to a life of real hard work, requiring strength, courage, infinite patience, and firmness. That Miss Bather had been able to organize a depot successfully and carry on the work entirely with the help of girl workers for over 2 years is a tribute to any woman, which can only be realized if the exact scope of the work is understood. The functions of workers at remount depots are to receive horses and mules which are sent to them and to make them fit for active service. The animals arrive mostly in rough condition, the horses being of all types, from the heavy draft horse to the colonel's charger. An expert has said, to be able to do this work, a girl must love her horse for himself, but that is not everything. She must be practical, capable, strong, self-denying, and brave. The horses are usually sent to the depot in mixed batches of 30 or more, dirty in their coats, perhaps thin and out of condition, and often lame or suffering from various ailments. It requires a lot of pluck in the first instance, writes Miss Bather, to unload from the railway trucks, saddle up, and mount those horses that look as if they had been ridden lately, and ride them, each rider leading another horse to their destination some 5 miles away. The grooming of the horses is hard work and requires considerable strength, even when the horse is quiet. With wild and difficult horses, it is necessary to hobble and muzzle them before grooming is possible. They are often deceptively quiet at first, and it may take a few days of bitter experience before the kickers and biters are discovered. Besides the daily grooming, which has to be performed for each horse like a child's toilette, there is clipping and singeing. After the grooming comes the work of keeping the stables, which must be cleaned out and disinfected daily, while the harness and tackle have to be cleaned and polished. There is also the care of the horses in sickness and convalescence, which requires particular skill and knowledge. With regard to the exercising, Miss Bather writes, "This is fraught with difficulties and anxieties, especially with a new lot of horses. To set the pace, someone responsible has to lead the straying with the quiet horses that will face the traffic. But though all army horses are supposed to be broken in, I have known our straying resemble a Wild West show." An eyewitness described an occasion when she happened to meet Miss Bather's lads out for exercising. One of the horses had taken fright and, breaking loose, had become entangled in barbed wire near the road. The onlooker states that the girls behaved with the utmost coolness, extricating the struggling horse with courage and skill and successfully preventing a stampede among the other horses. During the first year of her work, about 500 horses passed through Miss Bather's depot, and in June 1917 she completed her second year of work. Miss Dorothy Ravenscroft is another lady who has been doing similar work for the War Office. She is responsible for a remount depot at Chester, where, with the help of 12 girl assistants, 40 horses at a time are prepared for active service. The horses are mostly officers' cobs and chargers, and, as at the other depots, the girl workers do the entire work of the stables, as well as the exercising, grooming, and feeding of the horses. The post of superintendent of a remount depot is one of considerable responsibility, for the success of a depot depends largely upon the personality of the responsible head. Her life is necessarily one of continual anxiety, not only for the horses, but for her girl workers, who need to be chosen carefully. The work is far too great a strain physically and mentally for girls under 20. Writing to a friend recently, a superintendent said with truth, "One's nerves need to be made of iron. I am wondering how much longer mine will stand the strain." This is a question that women must be asking themselves in almost every branch of war work today, for all work just now is at high pressure. But the women at home are inspired with the same spirit as the men in the trenches and are equally prepared to go on until they drop. End of section 4. Section 5 of Women of the War by Barbara McLaren. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by T.R. Love. 10. Miss Edith Stoney and Dr. Florence Stoney. Miss Edith Stoney and her sister Dr. Florence Stoney are specialists in X-ray work. And in this vitally important branch of surgery, they have both rendered fine service throughout the war. Dr. Stoney was head of the electrical department in the new hospital for women, London. Early in the war, she went to Antwerp in Mrs. Sinclair Stobart's unit as head of the medical staff and in charge of the X-ray department. After the fall of Antwerp, when the hospital staff made their escape in London motor buses only 20 minutes before the bridge of boats was blown up, the unit was re-established in a hospital at Cherbourg under the French Croix Rouge. The X-ray work was, of course, invaluable, and in giving an account of it, Dr. Stoney wrote, "Most of our cases were septic fractures, for nearly all were septic by the time they reached us, 4 to 8 days generally after being wounded, and most of the fractures were badly comminuted as well. The X-rays were much in request to show the exact condition of the part and the position of the fragments. In all cases, the pieces of the shell had to be accurately located and were then, as a rule, easily extracted. With constant practice, it became possible for Dr. Stoney to tell by X-rays which were the dead pieces of bone in a comminuted fracture, for observation showed that they threw a denser shadow than living bone. One piece of dead bone 3 inches long was diagnosed first by X-rays, Dr. Stoney reported, and the early removal of these pieces greatly hastens recovery. When the hospital was inspected by the consulting surgeon for the district, his first inclination was to regard a hospital staffed by women as hardly worthy of inspection. But after going through the wards, he wrote, "L'hôpital de Tourlaville est très bien organisé. Les malades sont très bien soignés et les chirurgiens sont de valeur égale aux chirurgiens les meilleurs." When the British Army took over the northern part of the line in France, hospital arrangements were altered. The need for the Cherbourg Hospital was over, as all British movable cases were taken to England, and therefore, in the spring of 1915, the hospital was closed. Dr. Stoney returned to England and offered her services to the War Office, and in April 1915, she was asked to take over the X-ray department in the Fulham Military Hospital, a hospital of over 1,000 beds, where she is still working. Dr. Stoney took up this work about a fortnight before the opening of the Endell Street Hospital under Dr. Garrett Anderson. She is therefore the first woman doctor to work under the War Office in England. Dr. Stoney not only undertakes the photographic branch of the X-ray work, but she diagnoses and reports on the cases from the photographs. Another branch of her work is to use X-rays actually during operations for those surgeons who prefer to operate in this way. She also started a small department for X-ray treatment, which has proved beneficial in certain nerve and goiter cases. Dr. Stoney recently reported that considerably over 5,000 cases had passed through her hands since she came to this hospital. She has a staff of VAD assistants, 2 of whom she has trained in the work sufficiently to enable them to take over X-ray installations. One is now working in Romania and the other in London. Dr. Stoney's splendid work has completely overcome any prejudice which may have attached to her as a woman when she first took up her post. Although she is the only woman doctor in the hospital, she works on an equal footing with the men, except that she holds no military rank. Miss Edith Stoney is a woman of great university distinction, having been Wrangler in the mathematical tripos at Cambridge. She was an associate of Newnham College, Cambridge, and lecturer in physics to the London University. Astronomy is another subject on which she has lectured, and while at Newnham College, she had charge of the telescope. She has also done valuable original work in relation to searchlights. At the beginning of the war, Miss Stoney joined the committee of the hospital's Imperial Service League and helped in the organization of the hospital unit with which her sister went to Antwerp, fitting up the portable X-ray apparatus, which was subsequently of such great service. After the transfer of the hospital to Cherbourg, she continued to assist in the organization of its supplies. Her real war work, however, may be said to have begun when she retired from her work as lecturer in physics in the spring of 1915 and joined the Scottish Women's Hospitals. Miss Stoney first took up work at the Tent Hospital at Troyes, where she put up and ran the X-ray department, giving valuable assistance to the surgeons by the accurate localization of foreign bodies in wounds. The head surgeon, Dr. Louise Milroy, stated that she never failed to find a projectile searched for. This was indeed a tribute to the accurate localization in the X-ray department. Another valuable branch of Miss Stoney's work was the taking of stereoscopic skiograms. Miss Stoney took one of the very early skiograms of gas bubbles in the tissues due to gas gangrene, a development which has since come into great prominence. In the autumn of 1915, Miss Stoney accompanied the hospital unit from Troyes when it was ordered to Serbia by the French authorities. Before leaving for Serbia, she had the foresight to equip herself in Paris with a portable engine, as she was determined that her department should be efficient. On the committee refusing to sanction the expense, she bought it herself. Miss Stoney's action was soon justified, for when the hospital was installed at Jevgeli in Serbia, there was no electric supply. Thanks to her engine, not only was this the only British hospital able to work X-rays, but incidentally, as a byproduct of the X-ray department, Miss Stoney lighted the entire hospital with electricity. The need of much electric light in the dark winter days meant hard work for Miss Stoney, and the following extract from a letter conjures up a picture of work in no easy conditions. The electric light was needed in the pharmacy until the doctors had finished, and it was often late before I could stop the little engine and pack it up warm for the night. When I creaked up the ladders in stocking feet to the loft where 54 of us slept, there could be no thought of washing, with ice already in the jug. It was often an inch and a half thick by morning. Instead of undressing, one piled on every scrap of extra clothes one had, and put one's waterproof under the mattress to stop the draft up through it. When the French retreated from Jevgeli, a site was found for the hospital just outside Salonika, on a bit of ill-drained, marshy ground. There again the engine proved invaluable. From January 1916 onwards, Miss Stoney has run the X-ray department, doing, besides her own work, many radiograms for British and French doctors from other hospitals, who referred their cases to her for examination. At Salonika, Miss Stoney again lit the hospital with electric light. For several months, she was obliged to attend to the engine entirely alone, owing to the illness of the only mechanic. She further set up treatment by high frequency for the patients and radiant heat baths with vibratory massage. Having previously studied the Zander treatment, Miss Stoney was able to install an apparatus which, though she describes it as rough, was very successful in treating stiff joints requiring movement. She also used ionization for healing wounds with beneficial results. In all these ways, Miss Stoney has been able to bring her knowledge of physics to the service of the wounded. She has been a pioneer in her work in this physical department, which she has originated and developed at Salonika. "It is easy to work X-rays," she wrote, "when someone else has installed them, but in a moving hospital in difficult circumstances, physics is a help in getting the apparatus up and working well. We put in order the X-ray outfits of 2 British hospital ships calling at Salonika. The doctors and mechanics on board had not just the needed physics, but could work the apparatus perfectly well when it was installed." The Serbian government has decorated Miss Stoney with the Order of St. Sava in recognition of her services. But the reward of her fine work lies in the gratitude of the scores of her patients who owe their renewed health largely to her indomitable energy and the wonderful ingenuity and resource with which, in conditions of abnormal difficulty, she has brought so many projects to a successful and practical issue. Writing of her work lately, Miss Stoney says, "There is always sadness, but there is endless variety and interest in the life, and one trusts that the great privilege of easing a drop in the vast ocean of pain so bravely borne may have been ours." 11. The Baroness de Surclasse and Miss Marie Chisholm. Of all the splendid stories of the war, there is none that catches the imagination more than that of the work of Baroness de Surclasse, Mrs. Knocker, as she was in the early days of the war, and Miss Marie Chisholm. It is an unparalleled achievement that these 2 young women should have been living actually up in the firing line ever since the beginning of the war, tending and caring for the Belgian soldiers, dressing and nursing the wounded, and helping the men in the trenches by taking food and hot drinks to them day by day, even at the very outposts. Mrs. Knocker and Miss Chisholm, who was then only 18, first went to Belgium in September 1914 as members of Dr. Monroe's ambulance corps and started ambulance work in Gand and Furnes. From the first, their skill and courage were put to the highest test, and it would be hard to imagine greater bravery and devotion than they showed. For instance, in the fierce fighting at Dixmude in October 1914. Mrs. Knocker, who is an expert motor driver, drove an ambulance car to and fro on the road between Dixmude and Furnes under such heavy shell fire that men broke down and were unable to continue driving under the strain of the terrible ordeal. On one occasion, the ambulance was required to take some German prisoners as passengers, and with no other guard but Miss Chisholm, Mrs. Knocker drove her convoy along the shell-torn road. "I think it was the proudest moment of my life," she wrote in her diary. But the work for which their names will live began in November 1914, when the 2 severed their connection with the ambulance corps and started to work together in a little cellar in the ruined village of Pervis. Mrs. Knocker was led to take this step by her conviction, shared by the Belgian doctors, of the necessity of establishing an advanced dressing post where the severely wounded men might have time to recover from shock before enduring the jolting journey to the hospital, which had already proved fatal to many. Thus it was that these women, the eldest little more than a girl, took up their work. Through all these long months up to the present day, they have been living the lives of the soldiers themselves. Their quarters, for the most part, a tiny cellar, again and again under shell fire, sometimes suffering fierce bombardments, not taking off their clothes literally for weeks on end, eating anything they could get, and enduring the trials of cold, dirt, exhaustion, and danger with a gaiety and a courage which have been at once an inspiration and a source of astonishment to those who have been privileged to see them at Pervis. When the cellar was demolished, they moved to another tumble-down cottage, only to be shelled out twice more. But wherever they established themselves, it became home to the soldiers. their presence bringing a ray of comfort and brightness to the stern routine of life in the trenches. When in March 1915 a decree was passed by the commanders of the Allied armies in Paris forbidding the presence of any women in the firing line, at the request of the Belgian authorities, an exception was made for these two, mentioned by name, who were then officially attached to the 3rd Division of the Belgian Army in the field. No honor in the war has been better earned than the decoration which King Albert bestowed on each of them when he appointed them Chevalier of the Order of Leopold. As if to crown their wonderful story, romance came to one of them in the midst of that shot-torn village. The young widow, Mrs. Knocker, recently became the wife of a Belgian officer, Baron Hérold de Cerclas. End of section 5. Section 6 of Women of the War by Barbara McLaren. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by T.R. Love. 12. Lady Mary Hamilton, Miss Stella Drummond, and the Skilled Women Munition Workers. It is admitted on all sides that the output of munitions achieved by Great Britain since the spring of 1915 has been little less than miraculous, and this result is all the more astonishing when it is recalled that at least 25% of the men who were engaged in the chemical and engineering trades at the outbreak of hostilities have joined the Army. It was thus essential not only to fill the gaps, but also to augment the supply of available labor in answer to the increased demand. The women of the empire at once responded to the appeal for their help. A new and unsuspected reservoir of labor was thus discovered, without which, in the words of Mr. F.G. Kellaway, MP, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Munitions, the Germans would by now have won the war. The extent of the help rendered by women may perhaps be best realized by the fact that there are over 700,000 women engaged in munition work, employed on processes which cover practically the whole engineering and chemical trades. Under the general term munition work are included varied forms of work, both skilled and unskilled, undertaken by women. From the heavy manual labor of loading and unloading trucks of ammunition to the most intricate and delicate of engineering and electrical operations. To mention only a few of these highly skilled operations, women are building a great part of one of the best high-speed engines in the country, each woman setting her own tools, work which requires considerable technical skill. In the construction of chassis for heavy army lorries and in marine engine building, women are undertaking more and more responsible work. In the delicate work of constructing aero engines, they are turning on center lathes to 1/2 of an inch. Women are boring and rifling the barrel of the service rifle. They undertake hydraulic riveting of boilers. They work the electric overhead traveling cranes for moving the enormous boilers of our men of war. They are employed extensively on turbine work. So wide is the scope of women's capabilities, Mr. Kellaway stated recently, that a prominent engineer has expressed his conviction that given 2 more years of war, he would undertake to build a battleship from keel to aerial in all its complex detail, entirely by women's labor. And again, to watch young girls work hard for 12 hours a day, working on shells, lubricating bullets, handling cordite, making, inspecting, engaging fuses, examining work where the 1,000th part of an inch is a vital matter, running their machines deftly and easily, and spending their days in the danger buildings among explosives with as little fuss as if they were knitting socks, brings a realization of that which lies behind the list of operations on which women are engaged today. Women's skill on complicated processes has been acquired with a rapidity which has caused astonishment to experts. Before the war, an apprenticeship of 5 or 6 years was considered necessary amongst trade unions for gaining mastery of some of the processes which women have learned in a few months or even weeks. In measuring their achievement, however, it must never be forgotten what a debt is owed to British organized labor, which surrendered up in the hour of national crisis many of the legal rights and privileges established only after years of effort and controversy. The women munition workers of today have come from all ranks of society, from every corner of the empire, many of them entirely unaccustomed to industrial life or manual work, and many unacquainted even with life in England. An incident in one munitions works may be recalled as typical of the rest. Working side by side recently on the machines in a certain factory were a soldier's wife from a city tenement, a vigorous daughter of the empire from a lonely Rhodesian farm, a graduate from Girton, and a scion of one of the old aristocratic families of England. War has indeed proved a powerful solvent of social barriers, and one of the distinctive features of factory life in munition areas is the excellent leadership of the educated women who have entered the works. Typical of this class of munition workers are Lady Mary Hamilton, daughter of the Duke of Abercorn, and Miss Stella Drummond, daughter of General Drummond. These two friends, girls in years but soldiers in spirit, determined in the early stages of the war to serve their country by making munitions. Accordingly, they applied for work as ordinary hands in a munition factory, and for some 6 months were employed on repetition work in a shell factory. Lady Mary Hamilton has stated that she and Miss Drummond mastered the processes on which they were engaged in a few weeks, but admitted that a victory over the prejudices of the factory employees inclined to resent the introduction of swells was a lengthier task. Soon the skill of the two friends attracted the attention of those in authority, and they were selected for training in more advanced work. They were admitted into the factory school for skilled work, and after 5 weeks of this training, they proceeded to the government school at Brixton, London. There, they followed a 9-week course in such advanced work as tool making and tool setting, tasks which would not have been considered possible for women workers in pre-war days. After successfully completing their training, Lady Mary Hamilton and Miss Drummond were allocated to a factory where they were eventually placed in charge of 8 machines each, Wells turret capstan lathes. They were then entirely responsible for the output of their machines, which involved responsibility for the workers employed on them. In this shop, both boys and girls were employed, and the new charge hands or tool setters had to make good with the mixed staff. They were entirely successful, not only in the setting of the 5 or 6 requisite tools in each machine, and in the making and grinding of their own tools, but in producing an output which was accurate to within 200th part of a millimeter. So popular were they as leaders of their staff that when Lady Mary Hamilton recently resigned her post before her marriage, and Miss Drummond's services were transferred to the welfare supervision under the Ministry of Munitions, the regret expressed by the employees showed that they were losing comrades as well as officers. There were also countless instances of uneducated women who have found themselves equal to technical work of considerable responsibility. For example, in one factory, a woman driver works a 900-horsepower Willans plant. She starts the engine herself, if required, watches the voltmeter, and regulates the governor accordingly, wipes the commutators, and regulates the brushes. This woman was formerly a kitchen maid and had no technical experience whatever. Another working woman recently lost the first finger and thumb of her left hand owing to a loaded game jamming in the press. After an absence of 6 weeks, she returned to work and is today back on the same work and getting even greater output than before. Public recognition is due to the great army of women munition workers for their courage and endurance, both in the way in which they are facing the dangers incidental to some of their occupations and the monotony entailed in the regular performance of others. 13. Mrs. First, GBE, RRC, Lady Parrott, RRC, and the Voluntary Aid Detachment. Throughout the war, the services of the Joint Societies of the British Red Cross and the Order of St. John have covered a vast area of work for the sick and wounded. One of the most vital branches of the work has been that of the great army of untrained or part-trained women who have been supplementing the limited number of trained nurses in the hospitals at home and abroad. Sir Alfred Keogh, the Director General of the Army Medical Service, has explained the scope of their work when describing the organization of the Territorial Army Nursing System. He says, "It was necessary to arrange for the dilution of the nursing services by women who had received some special training, though of elementary character, to afford assistance to the more highly trained nurses. This had been foreseen, for at the time of the formation of the Territorial Army, the training of the civil population to this extent was taken in hand, and voluntary detachments of women in possession of elementary certificates, but receiving continuous training, were formed in the country. Thus, at the outbreak of war, there were some 60,000 women in England who had received this training. For a long period of years, the St. John Ambulance Association, under the ancient Order of St. John of Jerusalem, had already controlled a large organization of ambulance and nursing divisions, and may claim to have originated the teaching of first aid, which has now become the basis of all voluntary aid detachment training. When the scheme was started, detachments were formed throughout the country in answer to Queen Alexandra's appeal by the British Red Cross Society, the great new organization inaugurated by King Edward VII in July 1905, and also by the Order of St. John. Many of the old established St. John nursing divisions enrolled at once as voluntary aid detachments, their composition being similar. Shortly after the outbreak of the war, the British Red Cross Society and the Order of St. John decided to amalgamate their organization and finances for the period of the war. The administration of the voluntary aid detachments throughout the country is largely local. Each county has its own system under the central offices in London, and the work of the women, from the county presidents to the humblest workers, has been one of the proudest records of the war. Some voluntary aid detachments have been mobilized in their entirety for service in the auxiliary military hospitals, many of which have been almost entirely staffed and financed by individual detachments. Others are posting their members separately for hospital work elsewhere. The work of the VAD members besides nursing includes cooking, storekeeping, and secretarial work, which are classed under the heading of general service. This is the branch of work for which Mrs. Charles W. First, as Commandant-in-Chief of the VADs of the Joint Societies, is now responsible. The posting of the VAD nurses to hospitals at home and abroad also goes through her hands. Widow of the well-known painter and daughter of John Addington Symonds, Mrs. First was for several years before the war one of the most interested and prominent of VAD workers. When Sir Alfred Keogh's scheme for the organization of voluntary Red Cross workers came into being in 1909, Mrs. First was one of the first women to enroll. In 1912, she became Commandant of the 1st Paddington Detachment, London 128. During the next 2 years, she encouraged enterprise among the members by organizing classes in cooking, laundry, and hygiene, in addition to the study of first aid and home nursing. By this time, Mrs. First had become a member of several committees dealing with the Red Cross and VAD work, and was already recognized as an authority on these subjects. In the outbreak of war, her services were at once commandeered by the British Red Cross Society. For the first months of war, Mrs. First undertook the management of the Inquiry Department at Devonshire House, which became the headquarters of the VAD. In September 1914, she submitted a scheme to the War Office for VAD rest stations on the lines of communication. In October, she was ordered to go to France with sufficient members of her own detachment to start this work, which has been much extended and has met a great need. In January 1915, Mrs. First was recalled from France, where the rest station work was now established, to form a department for the coordination of VAD work and to organize a continual supply of probationers for the military and other hospitals. A selection board was formed at Devonshire House to deal with all applications of VADs for service at home or abroad. Mrs. First's duties also involve periodical inspections in France, where the work has been splendidly carried on by Miss Rachel Crowdy, the principal commandant in France. After one of her recent tours of inspection, Mrs. First reported, "The work of the VAD members in France is a credit to the women of the Empire. Wherever I went, I found the same anxiety to keep up the very high standard of work and behavior set by the organization. No job is too small for the VAD members, and they good-humoredly fill any gap which appears. The rules and regulations are very strict, and there is but little entertainment. The work is under war conditions, and the members try to show that they can wait till the end of the war for their playtime. Undoubtedly, the VAD organization is proving that women can be trusted in the zone of the armies, and that they have realized the meaning of discipline and appreciate the necessity of discretion." Many girls who went to France early in the war as practically untrained workers now hold splendid records of service in hospital and have risen to positions of considerable responsibility. In measuring the scope of what they have accomplished, it must not be forgotten that VAD members are drawn from very varied social positions, a large proportion being women accustomed to lives of luxury and ease, to whom the hard and often unattractive work has been a new and difficult experience. Mrs. First's great foresight into future needs during the earlier stages of the war, the untiring energy and patience with which she prepared for the time when these needs would be recognized, and above all, her immense personal influence, have proved her to be one of the real leaders whom the war has brought to light. It is largely through her fine personal example of the spirit in which all work should be done that the VADs have won for themselves such a good name for keenness and discipline. Lady Parrott, the Lady Superintendent-in-Chief of the St. John Ambulance Brigade, is another outstanding woman amongst the small number of workers who had the foresight to prepare themselves and others in peacetime for what then seemed the improbable chance of war. One of the most active pioneers of VAD work, Lady Parrott, for 5 years before the outbreak of war, worked under the War Office for VAD Development and Improvement. In 1910, she was appointed Lady Commandant-in-Chief of the St. John VADs. By constantly holding meetings and inspections of detachments all through the country, she helped to standardize the training and made herself acquainted with every detail of the work. Lady Parrott further performed a splendid service when she induced some of the principal hospitals, both in London and in the provinces, to give facilities for instruction to VAD members. This experience in civil hospitals proved of immense value when the war started. In 1913, Lady Parrott organized a conference on VAD work, which was held at St. John's Gate and attended by large numbers of St. John VAD officers from all over the country. The effect of this conference was to arouse widespread enthusiasm for the work. Her own personal and detailed knowledge of the detachments stood Lady Parrott in good stead in the stress of the early days of war. When the call came from the War Office for VAD members to serve in military hospitals, the whole organization for selecting and posting the St. John members was in her hands, and she carried out this work with marked success. She also went to France from time to time to inspect. From the beginning, Lady Parrott toiled early and late at St. John's Gate, and by her great powers of organization, as well as by her personal influence and untiring zeal, she was able to initiate and carry out an enormous amount of work. Apart from all she has done for the VAD, Lady Parrott holds a fine record of achievement. To mention only one of her other activities, it was through her instrumentality that the Board of Matrons was appointed at St. John's Gate for the selection of fully trained nurses, 100 of whom were sent out to Brussels in the first 3 weeks of the war by the order of St. John. Lady Parrott has also been largely associated with the St. John Ambulance Brigade Hospital, one of the finest hut hospitals in France, for which she has collected a large sum of money, besides organizing a special depot for its supply of stores and comforts. Lady Oliver is another untiring worker to whose keenness and energy much of the success of the VAD activities is due. As staff officer to Lady Parrott before the war, she was responsible for a large part of the detailed work. Since the formation of the Joint Department, Lady Oliver has worked with Mrs. Firth at Devonshire House. Lady Parrott, Lady Oliver, and Mrs. Firth have all been decorated by the King with the Royal Red Cross and are also members of the Order of St. John, Lady Parrott and Lady Oliver being Ladies of Justice and Mrs. Firth a Lady of Grace. End of section 6.